The modern corporate empire is built on a grand optical illusion, where weak men wear weaponized wool to simulate unyielding authority. Human biology automatically decodes geometric shapes as absolute dominance, while soft biological curves are instantly targeted as submissive prey. A calculated predator never reveals internal panic. Instead, they choose to encase their shivering skin inside rigid fabrics. The eyes of the victim look upward, paralyzed by a silhouette constructed entirely of synthetic confidence. Look at the sharp charcoal shoulders cutting through space. They artificially expand a fragile ego while consuming the light. The unconscious mind naturally worships straight lines, assuming that geometric perfection equates to intellectual superiority. A perfectly structured suit is an external spine, designed specifically to deceive the primitive brain of unsuspecting subordinates. The submissive observer shrinks into a faded gray fabric. Their biological posture collapses completely under psychological weight. Authority is rarely earned through actual competence. It is instead manufactured through calculated visual violence. A single touch of vivid crimson cuts the monochrome silence, mesmerizing the target while a trap closes around their judgment. Notice how the sharp collar isolates the head, forcing a mask of artificial calm over absolute inner chaos. The corporate predator stands motionless in the shadow, projecting an illusion of eternal permanence that demands total submission. Every stitch on the fabric is a calculated threat, a physical manipulation that commands the room without uttering a word. The victim voluntarily surrenders their mental autonomy, hypnotized by the rigid geometry of a highly structured fraud. But remember that an exquisite cage remains a cage, and the well-dressed corpse inside is completely rotting. Every millimeter of space you willingly give up is territory they instantly conquer, with silent predatory intent. Watch how the sharp shoulder lines stand, completely rigid against the fading light, while others bend low. The submissive body naturally attempts to disappear, shrinking away into unshaped cloth creases, like a cornered animal. They do not need to speak loud to force your entire spine to collapse under their heavy gaze. A dropped shoulder is a silent invitation, telling the tyrant exactly where to strike, without meeting your eyes. The predator expands their chest box artificially, inflating a flat caricature of competence to dominate the room. Notice the calculated stillness of the oppressor, contrasting sharply with the anxious micro-movements of their terrified target. Your system mistakes their synthetic posture for stability, blindly trusting an architectural mask designed to drain your autonomy. The geometry of fear is drawn clearly in the broken angles of your posture, against their upright grid. Look closely at how they occupy space, carving out dominance through padded silhouettes that steal the oxygen. An unyielding collar blocks any signs of raw biological panic from escaping their throat into the open air. You believe you are fighting an intellect, but you are merely losing a battle against weaponized structural tailoring. The subservient observer retreats further into gray as the dark charcoal outline closes in, suffocating all escape routes. They trap you within the sharp margins of a world they built out of dark ink and iron. Your submission becomes a permanent physical habit, leaving you completely crushed beneath a suit that possesses no soul. Color is never neutral in the corporate hierarchy. It is an active weapon wielded to suffocate the lower ranks. The dark charcoal fabric operates as a visual black hole, absorbing every single stray ray of light until the room turns cold. Underlings are systematically stripped of vibrant hues, forced to drown in muddy gray that signals absolute insignificance. Chromatic dominance requires a flat monochrome background, where any sign of individual identity is ruthlessly erased. The calculated tyrant demands total aesthetic submission, long before they ever issue a command to their broken prey. A stark white shirt provides the ultimate baseline contrast, making the deep void of the jacket look infinitely heavier. The human brain subconsciously surrenders its logic when confronted by an unyielding dark wall, masquerading as order. Every shade of gray in the corporate matrix represents a precisely calculated level of compliance, extracted from the weak. They do not wear clothes to express personal taste. They use specific dark pigment concentrations to paralyze all resistance. Observe how the monochrome tyrant systematically drains the environment, leaving their victim stranded in a void, with no escape. The sole exception to this absolute lack of color is a single piercing slash of crimson, bleeding across the chest. This deliberate red anchor captures the submissive gaze, locking the target in a hypnotic paralysis, while judgment fails. In this grim theater of tailored manipulation, texture and shade dictate the absolute law of survival. The victim remains entirely unaware of the trap, blinded by a pristine structural authority facade that conceals a rot. They continue to serve an empty outer shell, worshipping a dark corporate shadow that has no human heart. The heavily padded shoulder serves a dark psychological purpose, masking the trembling pulse of fear behind artificial armor plates. Biology dictates that stress causes muscles to shake violently, forcing the modern predator to build walls out of stiff fabric. The thick foam lining absorbs every micro-tremor completely, ensuring that no subordinate ever witnesses vulnerability within the concrete office. A perfectly squared torso creates a deceptive illusion, projecting an unyielding facade of absolute stability to deceive the weak mind. Beneath the rigid exterior lies a shivering coward, terrified of losing their tenuous psychological grip on the executive floor. They rely on sharp corners to terrify others, carving out an artificial kingdom of intimidation with heavy industrial shoulder pads. When the body encounters threats, it prepares for, triggering a primitive evolutionary response that demands total physical expansion. The manipulator bypasses natural biological limitations through tailoring, using thick structured layers to simulate mass they do not possess. The helpless target observes the massive artificial silhouette, internalizing their own perceived physiological inferiority without a single word spoken. Why do human beings automatically fear sharp geometry? Because our primitive neural wiring associates squares with impenetrable stone walls. A sharp shoulder pad cuts a clean horizontal, cutting through the soft organic air currents like a jagged blade. It acts as a visual shield against interrogation, blocking the diagnostic gaze of the observer from detecting the fraud. The structured jacket never sags or showing fatigue, maintaining a permanent lie of eternal vigilance in a decaying corporation. They freeze their posture into a permanent state, trapping their own biological system inside iron to avoid showing panic. Weaponized armor will always conceal an entirely hollow corporate corpse, rotting. The vertical pinstripes cutting down the dark jacket operate as a severe prison matrix, instantly locking the gaze of the subordinate within an inescapable geometry. Human eyes naturally follow parallel tracks, unconsciously assuming that straight structural tracks possess infallible logic. The corporate predator employs these continuous vertical rays to deceptively elongate their physical presence, creating an illusion of infinite moral altitude that crushes the observer. Every chalk line on the wool is an unyielding boundary, designed explicitly to slice the open space into micro-zones of submission. While the victim struggles to maintain an independent train of thought, their cognitive system slowly surrenders to the alignment of the structural pattern. The pattern does not merely cover the flesh. It effectively programs the subconscious mind to accept a false hierarchy. Notice how the rigid white lines never curve or bend during the encounter, projecting a deceptive myth of total corporate immortality over a dying soul. The subservient employee stares helplessly at the mathematical armor, as their own unstructured thoughts dissipate into the dark air. A calculated tyrant uses linear intimidation to completely dominate the visual landscape, ensuring that any chaotic emotional outbreak is instantly neutralized by geometry. The room becomes a grid of absolute compliance, where the pinstriped jacket dictates the narrow path of permissible human behavior. The stark contrast of the fabric stripes acts as a visual hypnotic device, blinding the helpless target until they blindly obey the underlying deception. They mistake structural lines for genuine personal integrity, willingly placing their corporate destiny inside a box built by a tailor. Watch the sharp stripes merge seamlessly with the architecture of the boardroom, transforming the manipulator into an inseparable extension of the cold system. The illusion of perpetual dominance is now fully complete, as the trembling prey worships the flawless symmetry of their oppressor. Linear perfection always hides an utterly hollow soul that is rotting. A sea of cold monochrome demands a single blinding target, capturing the primitive visual cortex before logical defense can form. The crimson anchor is not an aesthetic decoration. It is a tactical visual trap designed to capture your focus. When the eye locks onto that blood-red stripe, your analytical judgment immediately starts to decay and collapse. Calculated predators use this hyper-saturated weapon strategically, distracting the target from subtle inconsistencies in their false arguments. The vivid red bleeds into your cognitive awareness, forcing all peripheral warning signs to fade into gray. You believe you are examining their strategic proposals, but you are merely staring directly at a calculated optical trap. The solid crimson tie acts as a visual compass, guiding your subconscious obedience deeper into their corporate cage. Underneath that piercing beacon of absolute authority, a web of systematic exploitation is silently weaving its trap. The helpless victim becomes completely mesmerized by color, losing the ability to question the tyrant's hidden motives. It isolates your focus within a tight margin, preventing your neural system from processing the true scale of deception. Look at the blinding contrast of the red anchor, slicing through the pale office air like a clean wound. The manipulator stands completely motionless behind the bright beacon, projecting a synthetic image of supreme dominance that paralyzes your volition. Every visual frequency is mathematically arranged to conquer, forcing the weak subordinate to kneel before an empty jacket. Your critical thinking is entirely suspended by design, hypnotized by the blood-colored emblem of a cold institution. The scarlet anchor will always guard a completely hollow dark void, rotting. The mahogany conference table turns into a psychological theater, where boxy tailored garments aggressively conquer the spatial matrix, leaving no breathing room for the weak. The corporate predator subtly broadens their rigid elbows, expanding an artificial geometry across the polished surface, while eyes drop downward. A defenseless target automatically retreats behind their narrow desktop margins, as the heavy pinstriped outline systematically claims every single inch of available office territory. Why do human beings automatically fear sharp geometry? Because our primitive neural wiring associates squares with impenetrable stone walls. Watch how the stiff charcoal coat maintains its flawless square silhouette, while the soft fabrics of the victim completely collapse under immense invisible compression. The leather executive chair morphs into a synthetic throne, where padded shoulders dictate the law of survival without uttering words. The manipulator leans slightly forward with absolute geometric calculation, forcing their broad chest plate to cast an immense dark net over the entire boardroom. Every movement of the weaponized fabric is carefully calibrated to choke the spatial independence of the submissive observer into absolute nothingness. The helpless employee shrinks deeper into their shapeless, faded gray shirt as the aggressive charcoal contours relentlessly push forward. suffocating any internal resistance. A single piercing slash of crimson slices the office air, locking the target in a state of cognitive paralysis while control shifts. Space is never shared equally within a corrupt corporate empire. It is a raw canvas where structural outlines violently dictate the rules of engagement. The unyielding high collar effectively isolates the calculating head, projecting a myth of absolute unmovable permanence over the terrified crowd. Notice how the architectural shadow lines of the office expand dynamically, intertwining directly with the pinstriped jacket to form an inescapable cell around the target. The submissive victim surrenders their autonomy entirely, paralyzed by the unbending architecture of tailoring that hides total emptiness. The absolute ruler of space is an empty suit, rotting. Strip away the weaponized wool from their frames, and the grand illusion immediately shatters into a pathetic reality. They possess no genuine internal authority or substance, merely relying on structured canvas panels to bribe your respect. The corporate predator is a parasite to tailoring, unable to stand upright without the spine of an expensive jacket. Watch how the sharp shoulder pads define them, while the actual flesh beneath is withered by absolute moral cowardice. Without the clean geometric lines of the coat, they look completely indistinguishable from the very targets they seek to destroy. They are deeply terrified of visual vulnerability, knowing that an unpadded silhouette reveals their true, pathetic scale. The entire corporate hierarchy is built on clothing hangers masquerading as powerful gods over a desperate workforce. They wrap their shivering insecurities in premium fabric, hoping that the high-frequency contrast will blind your judgment forever. The submissive observer begins to notice the flaw, recognizing that the tyrant's terrifying volume is entirely bought from tailors. A single touch of vivid crimson cannot save the fading illusion of supreme corporate command from losing its grip. The unbending collar can no longer conceal the raw biological panic that is suffocating their artificial corporate persona. They are prisoners to their own immaculate wardrobe, forced to maintain a rigid stone facade until the mask breaks. The geometry of intimidation begins to lose its absolute hypnotic power over the minds of the exhausted lower ranks. They look at the pristine structural attire now, realizing they are merely worshiping an expensive shell that hides absolute nothingness. The parasitic empire is ruled entirely by well-tailored rascals who are completely rotting. Midnight systematically strips away the false corporate architecture, exposing a deeply fractured biological reality within the lonely dressing room. The heavy, structured charcoal jacket is unbuttoned, releasing a hidden wave of accumulated exhaustion into the absolute darkness. When the rigid shoulder pads slide off, a withered, slumped physical posture immediately emerges, betraying the supreme myth. The immaculate fabric ceases to function as armor, allowing the raw internal tremors to dominate the shivering human flesh. A pristine white shirt is unceremoniously peeled, unmasking a weak, sweating chest cavity underneath that gasps for oxygen. They look directly into the cold glass, confronting an unadorned reflection that completely lacks any synthetic corporate power. The solid, vivid crimson tie is untied, dropping down like a severed blood vessel onto a heap of wool. Why does the former tyrant shake violently? Because their fragile ego cannot exist without weaponized structural tailoring patterns. The dark armor lies crumpled on the cold floor tiles, looking like an empty, discarded insect shell casing. Every linear pinstripe loses its oppressive hypnotic grip as the solitary figure hunches forward, weeping in absolute isolation. The unyielding high collar no longer clamps, the throat allowing the suppressed panic to flood the private space. Shadows stretch unnaturally along the pristine walls, mocking the complete collapse of a fraud who ruled through fabric. They realize the terrifying truth of their utter dependence on a well-tailored silhouette, to extort human submission. The carefully constructed corporate facade has dissolved, leaving a broken, shivering human creature completely abandoned in the shadow. The absolute ruler without armor is a shivering, hollow ghost completely rotting. The corporate illusion finally loses its grip as the truth reveals a broken system of control. The submissive observer looks at the throne, understanding how synthetic armor frames the empty executive space. People blindly worship geometric lines in panic, forgetting that cloth never guarantees actual human intelligence. The pristine boardroom stands entirely stripped bare, exposing an array of hollow wooden clothing hangers. Every crisp charcoal suit jacket folds completely, deflating into a flat pool of black ink lines. The victim slowly steps out from darkness, leaving behind a matrix built on tailored intimidation. They no longer flee from padded shoulder, recognizing that structural tailoring merely hides internal vulnerability. A single slash of solid, vivid crimson glows faintly over the abandoned pile of expensive fabric. The primitive brain regains its lost autonomy, refusing to bow down before an architectural fraud. Watch how the massive corporate towers tilt, leaning unnaturally against a cold, white, grid background canvas. The mechanical corporate smile disappears into vacuum, leaving behind an unadorned reflection of absolute nothingness. The empire collapses under its own weight, crushed entirely by the heavy burden of a grand lie. Subordinates walk away into the open air, abandoning the grid cells of systemic mental enslavement. The remaining charcoal silhouettes fade into dust, dissolving completely into the flat background. Ink layers. Empty suits rule this world, hiding a hollow, dead soul, rotting